Join us on our Discord, the Greater Mandala. For access, sign up to the Order of Fire's mailing list.
All right, you are listening to or watching PH2T3R, Pater, the Journal of Solar Culture. And I'm here, as always, with my co-host, C.B. Robertson, author of many fine books, including one of his favorite pieces that he's ever written, apparently, Descending Odin's Throne, which is in our new PH2T3R book. The Journal of Solar Culture is also a published book, so if you haven't read that, that gives us, that essay in particular and a couple that I wrote in there, give a written form of some of the arguments that we've made and kind of put a lot of things into a more established context rather than us just talking about things that you can intuit from us discussing them. But this is writing, as I did a reel about this yesterday, but writing is one of those areas where you get to you can see your work, and so that's what makes it different, is that like we can talk in circles and say all kinds of things, but when a paragraph has to line up with the next paragraph and those two ideas have to make sense together, then you can really see the progression of thoughts.
And as a process of discovery, writing in long form is fun too, because I mean we're pretty big fans of Nietzsche as much as the next guy, but your Apollo's Broken Mask essay really parted ways from the classical Nietzschean interpretation of what Apollo means in I think a very interesting and cool way for people who are into the whole Apollonian Dionysian thing. It feels like long form allows you to add significant weighty contributions to very old conversations in a way that short form hot take stuff from social media sort of can't do in the same way. So it's fun.
You have to have the big essay, and then you have to dumb it down into like less than 1 minute for the little clips. Right. Like what is the way that I can say this and get this idea across in less than a minute? And that's not always the best way to communicate ideas. That gives you a little taste. I'm actually working on a reel today and yesterday. I was out shooting in Sedona, and I really just want an excuse to use special effects. I'm not gonna lie, but I'm like, I know how to do it. I have this power now. There's this video editing thing, things that only Industrial Light and Magic could do in the '90s. I can do in an hour now. Like with the tools that I have. So it's so exciting to be able to do stuff. So actually condensing some of the thoughts that we started with your idea. Actually, you started talking about sorcery, and then we did that whole series on magic and modernism and talking about what magic is. And so I'm doing the 1 minute version of magic.
Nice.
Nice. But hopefully I'm going to buy some stuff where I can throw like a Doctor Strange like mandala up in the middle air, and so
cool.
It's going to be fun. But our podcast today. Our show today is about sex and gender.
Speaking of magic.
Exactly, speaking of magic. And very much so. I mean, when we're talking about pronouncements of saying things and changing definitions of things, there's that man is now a woman, that woman is now a man. If everyone says it and they use the right pronouns, then they've basically created that reality to a certain extent. It's not a physical reality, and it never will be. And it really isn't a reality in a lot of ways. But the idea that they're using is to if we could make it work with magic, and if we say it enough times, then it'll be true. Like the best one is men can get pregnant. Just say it enough times, and then people will say yes, that's true. And there are many people who will just yes, that is true, and that is totally magic. The word that we're talking about today is another usage of magic that's been brought. It's a whole concept that's been brought into the world that I don't think a lot of people know about. And the reason why I started talking about this was, if you question any of these arguments about the trans thing, or changing a man for a woman or whatever, or what is a woman, that question, you'll be lectured by someone who was, indoctrinated in the college system, by someone who'll say, there is a difference between sex and gender.
Yeah.
And there's a million people out in the world right now who will say, there is a difference between sex and gender. And I knew that was fairly recent, that was created, but I hadn't really done the research on it. And apparently it is discussed a little bit in Matt Walsh's video, What is a Woman? But I haven't watched that because I don't really follow the Daily Wire scene because it's kind of boring. But it's kind of tired and Christian nationalists and whatever. But I get that was covered, so a little people were more familiar with this than I thought. But I wanted to go back into the research, and I ended up. I guess I didn't have to, but I ended up reading, I think, 80 pages of this feminist text, and I had to pull up the title because I'd forgotten it already. It's called "Gender: A Genealogy of an Idea."
Who's the author of that?
It is J. German, like Germon. It was written in 2009. And
I would say that the Germans got nothing to do with it, but in this case, the Frankfurt School probably does. So I can't say that, but yeah.
Yeah, well, and then you get into like sexology was actually really big in pre-World War II Germany. And it was kind of one of the things that they were rebelling, because there were all these sexologists doing all this research about sex, which I researched that years and years ago. But it was like 1910s, something about that. There was a bunch of that going on in Germany.
Inspiring to kill my Smokey and the Bandit references.
But
anyways, yeah, it's good.
But yeah, no. So the book was written by this J. German. They always abbreviate their names in these texts because it's a woman. Or maybe it's a woman, because there's literally only one picture of her on the internet, which I find very strange. So I don't know if this is a trans person or what, but because that happens a lot. But it was written by a gender studies person out in Australia, and basically the theory of the book was to trace the history of the word gender. So it was the correct book to investigate this subject. And so I learned a little bit more about it than maybe I had to, and had to read a lot of feminist theory. I thought that was my wheelhouse because, back when I was writing The Way of Men and before that, like no one would go and actually read that stuff. And now we do have like other guys who will go out and do the research of that kind of thing. But I was the only one who would sit and I'm actually going to read feminist literature to figure out what they're actually saying. And now we have, James Lindsay and people who like that who will go and do a little bit more investigation like that. But so I read through this, and basically she wanted to trace the word of gender, and her objective in doing this was actually to bring the intersexed back into the argument. It was like the next level of in the dialectic engine of intersectionality. She like felt that like intersex had been pushed to the margins. And so the whole point of writing this book was to bring the intersexed back into discussion and not treat them like there's something wrong with them, which, it's awkward because, like that's a birth defect. Like being intersexed is a birth defect. It's not like, it's not an idea. It's not like I've just decided to become something. It's a birth defect. And like, you're not supposed to say that, but it's just like you were born with a valve in your heart that doesn't work right.
Right.
That's a birth defect. And her idea in writing this book is that like, there are all different kinds of gendered people, and so these people need to be included.
It implies a kind of tacit relativism that there isn't any kind of wrong, like superior or inferior way to be born. Now, I wish that I had inherited, an extra couple inches of height and maybe better skin, that would be objectively better. But that doesn't stop me from making use of what I have, but the idea, the aversion to having it, to even entertaining a like better or worse ways of being, seems to have found some reductio ad absurdum points in the modern times with body dysmorphia that causes people to self amputate certain limbs. That seems to be like
right.
the sort of the reductio ad absurdum, the logical conclusion where most sane people like, okay, if this is where this reasoning takes us, maybe we went astray somewhere in the past.
Yeah. Well, and I have a great example of it from my jiu-jitsu gym is that, like the opposite of saying like, no birth defect happened. It's just naturally the magical way that you are. I have a guy who is a black belt in jiu-jitsu who doesn't have hands. He was born in a way that his I'm assuming it's birth defect and not from an accident because it kind of looks like that. But it's just he has one kind of finger that then just goes into a stub on his arm. So it's like this like long finger and then kind of a nub and then it's kind of the same thing on the other side. And that dude that hasn't let it stop him. And he's been that way the whole life. He drives a big ass truck. I don't even like he drives a big ass truck. He has a farm. He runs horses. Like he rides horses and like I don't know if he rides horses, but where he just like has horses. But like he kills goats and like it's he will choke you. He will take that finger and grab your gi. And he's figured out how to use it, and like he's amazing.
Yeah.
And so that is, I'm sure he would agree because he's a pretty conservative guy actually. I'm sure he'd agree that he had a birth defect, and then just like, okay, well this is what I got, and I'm going to work with it. Yeah. And that's more that's the attitude you have to have, right? With that kind of situation, or but it's unfortunate. And the genesis of, which I guess we should get to, of this whole idea of sex and gender, basically where it comes from is this guy named John Money, who was a sexologist, among other things. And he was really involved with these people who were born and you couldn't tell what gender they were. Or what sex they were. What sex they were. See, it's created such a mess.
Yeah.
But before John Money, this was 1955, before John Money, people really only used the word gender for linguistics, like in foreign languages, like le and la and di and all those gendered words.
How you conjugate different family, it's different. Like there are masculine words and feminine words, and it didn't have a sexual connotation as far as like male or female in the human form. It was just a way of categorizing how you'd conjugate different kinds of words.
Right. And there's a history of people using it. It was described in one of the papers that I read about it in a jocular way in literature. Even in 1890s or something, they'd say gender and you knew that they meant sex, like kind of in a joking way. Because people who studied languages would make those kind of like high-end jokes. But it really wasn't until John Money was dealing with these intersexed or hermaphrodites, basically, where they were born with like two kinds of genitalia or like, everything was missing or where is it? And so basically they had to make a call. And there's a lot of scandal around John Money because a lot of what he did was, like
unethical.
Snip, snip, you're a girl now, because he was making a call about, and that's just where they get the word assign, gender,
yes. which they now say is true of everybody. Everybody was assigned gender at birth. They say.
Right. But this is where that comes from. Mm-hmm. And a normal doctor will tell you that they observe a gender. Like, okay, I mean, they observe a sex in a baby. But, they're assigned, a sex, but if they don't have an apparent one.
Yeah.
Now they can test DNA, they can do all kinds of other stuff and make a better choice. But John Money was the one who came up with, he borrowed from linguistics, he borrowed the word gender and used it, attached it to sex. And for him, it was still attached to sex because he was trying to choose a sex, really. But there was a separate thing, basically. Like, if for these people who don't have an obvious sex, what is their, how do we know how they feel and whatever? And that's why he created gender, because there was a separate, because there's no sex. So, like, what is this thing? How do we describe that thing? And we didn't need that before, because it'd be like sex, male, female, masculine, feminine. And there wasn't a need for this separate magical thing. But for Money, it was still attached to sex. And then another guy came around, Stoddard or something like that. Forgot if I have my notes, but another psychologist came into the picture. It was a dude, and he worked on it, and then he made it more of a detached thing. Like, this is not necessarily correspond to sex. This is, sexual ideas, and it also separated it from the act of sex. Like, your gender is this separate thing of whether you're masculine or feminine, but it's not attached to like physical sex or the act of sex or anything like that. So he separated it out fully. And then it was the feminists in the 1970s who then, because that guy was actually doing a lot of work with transsexuals. And so the whole thing is an argument from pathology. This creation of the word gender is an argument from pathology. And then the feminists took it up.
Go
ahead.
As a sort of aside, have you heard of the positive psychology movement? So this problem is not unique to sex and gender. It's basically it has characterized basically all of psychology for the last 100 years. People realized they've been creating models in psychology based exclusively on studying people with problems, based exclusively on studying pathologies and problems. And a few psychologists realized maybe we're making really bad models or really incomplete models. And maybe to round out our whole field, we need to start building models of healthy psychology based on healthy people, not based on odd cases on the outside that we use to try to map, because studying odd cases can be very useful. If you see someone with a railroad spike through a very particular part of their brain, and then it affects their behavior in a very particular way. Thank you, Phineas Gage, for your service. It's very helpful in mapping on what does what where in your neuroanatomy. But it can lead to problems like this, and the construction of entire models based upon presumptive opposites of pathologies and that kind of thing. So positive psychology has been a movement within the psychological world to try to begin with healthy people rather than beginning with the pathologies. But it's I think it's got a fair ways to go in the gender part of psychology.
Well, and the big problem, and if anyone who was in our Discord group, I put out some of the videos that we were watching in preparation for this podcast, and I actually put Judith Butler. I sat through a video of Judith Butler talking about gender, and then I also put James Lindsay in there. Is he James? John?
James Lindsay, yeah.
Okay, James Lee. I put James Lindsay in there, and I listened to his take on it too, and what he's and obviously, the positive psychology movement would come into conflict with the Marxist part of things, because it's going to, you can't establish a norm. You're supposed to bring the margins to the center, is what he kept saying in the video, is like bring the margins to the center. And that's really what, this person who was writing this other book, bring the intersex to the center. And these people,
and this goes all the way back to the first framing of the question, what is a woman? Yeah. Which goes back to Simone de Beauvoir, fucking French.
Beauvoir, yeah.
Beauvoir, yeah. Beauvoir, yeah. And her book, The Second Sex. which basically frames the female, and she's calling it sex, but she's really talking about gender before gender has been made a thing, as this performative role that is like an inferior version of the default sex, which is male. And of course, that, like, I haven't read her book. I wouldn't put money on reading it in the next decade. We can talk about whether she's talking about biologically or socially. I would assume socially, but that seems to have been the first, the origin point where being female is not just about being biologically XX chromosome.
Right.
It has this social role, this performative aspect, as Judith Butler might say.
Yeah. And I may have actually looked at that book at least like years ago, because it would have been in my kind of range of things to look at. But I believe that she was dating or married to or whatever Jean-Paul Sartre.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. So that's all kind of Marxist stuff too. But yeah, and this performative aspect that you're talking about, if anyone watched the Judith Butler video, that's very much Judith Butler's take. And James Lindsay describes her as saying her whole oeuvre as being the everything is drag. And I've heard drag queens say that, like in real life. It's just if you put on a fake role, you then perceive everybody as being put on a fake role, and everybody's just pretending.
This reminds me of
that's the idea.
This reminds me of the federal actors, or the Federal Actors Guild from Team America, the FAG or whatever. Their special skill is acting and pretending to be other people. And I think other people have talked about that. I'm sure Plato would have, maybe critical things to say about that in what was it, Book 9 of the Republic? Actors and people pretending to be all kinds of weird things.
But it's not wrong. The thing is that's when an idea gets hold of people, it's because there is an element of truth in it, and the truth in the idea that we perform, let's say, our sex role. This is what they called it before they called gender. It was sex role or sex identity or whatever. Because there are aspects of masculinity. I mean, obviously, I've spent my entire life, adult life, basically investigating and talking about what masculinity is, and there are aspects of masculinity that are absolutely performative. Well, the way that they are. I mean, like there's so many like social cues and things like that. Well, how are you going to behave around certain guys? Are you going to censor yourself in a certain way because guys are going to judge you in a different way? Yes. Are you going to all these things that you do socially to be accepted as a man? And the point that I made in my essay about it is that for most normal people, that's considered a good thing. It's almost like a fake it till you make it kind of thing, like that. Okay, like do the right things, and you'll kind of be rewarded by society, but that's also like a Judith Butler's character's criticism of it, because they are manipulating you to become a certain way.
Well, there's a very subtle equivocation that is introduced with the word perform.
Right.
Because you can use perform in a couple of different senses. And the whole gender is performative statement, that magic spell, we might say, is built upon a very conscious and intentional equivocation between saying perform in a like technical bureaucratic sense, as in performing your duties.
Right.
And equating that and switching that around with performing in the more general colloquial sense of putting on an act. Like if you are performing the role of a guard, for example, at some building, the guard who actually guards that building is performing that role in a sense. But if you are an actor playing a guard who is guarding a building, but you're actually an actor and you're not literally actually guarding a building. That is a very different sense of the word perform. And the phrase, gender is performative, slides these two things together as if they are equivalent and tries to draw these sort of grand conclusions from this, that it is coming from an equivocation which I think normal people might do accidentally. With someone like Judith Butler, I don't think it's accidental. I would assume it's not accidental because she's a very smart person and thinks through these kinds of things, or is supposed to if you're a philosopher. But
I'm sure she does. But okay, so with someone like Judith Butler, what you're seeing, it's this argument from pathology again. You're seeing a little girl who is very different and didn't feel like she wanted to behave the way she was being told to behave. Because there is an element of when you're dealing with little boys and little girls, like, no, little girls don't do that, little boys don't do that, and like, boys don't do that, boys don't cry, like, there's little things that you do give subtle cues, and they talk about parenting and all this stuff. Like, there are subtle cues that society gives and parents give and all this. This is how males behave and this is how females behave. And if you're not feeling those things like naturally, or all of them, or whatever, then it creates a sense of being like an outsider to a certain extent, or that these people are just doing the role. They're just doing what they're told, and I don't want to, but that means everyone's faking it. And I think that that's the key of the argument. I feel like I'm being asked to do something that I don't feel that naturally follows.
So like projection.
There's an element of projection, but I do think that 3/4 of the little boys that are told not to cry will just fucking stop crying, and then because they all do. Little boys cry all the time.
They do.
And so and.
Yes.
They get signals that is not the way they're supposed to behave because they're being groomed into what being a man is. And that is part of the process. You get told, we say, like, you have to be. It's interesting that Simone de Beauvoir would have come up with the idea that a woman becomes a woman. Because that's what we always say, and Mishima said this, that a man becomes a man and a woman just is.
Yeah.
But women just kind of are what they are. But they're more the default. But men have to be trained to a certain extent.
Right.
And
I believe biologists have come down on that view too, that women are the default and men are actually this slightly more modified. And you'll get some slightly psychopathic feminists that try to capitalize on that in some way, say men are inferior because of this. It's like,
dude, my old friend used to know that was the best way to trigger me, was to say that. To say, well, we all start out as women anyway, because there's this argument about we're kind of neutral, sexed in the womb for a little bit, and then the Y kicks in and then we become boys, but we always had the XY. It was always there. So I was like, it's always there. But we did not start out as women. No, so people take that as the female is female is what's natural and the man is an aberration. It was how a radical feminist would take it. But
it sort of cuts against the Simone de Beauvoir patriarchal men are the default. Presumption. In some ways. These can't both be true.
If you think about a woman in the 1950s or earlier would have been told, she would have been instructed on how a woman behaves. Very, very, it wouldn't have been
as men are.
It wouldn't have been subtle. It would have been no. And by the way, you're going to submit to your husband. And they're in very specific language that's going to be used. And whereas now it's a little bit more how do you feel? There's a little more open now. But in most societies, it was very strictly this is your role as a woman, and you learn it.
Yeah.
And so like like I said, I have to acknowledge that there is an element of someone just gave me the script and I'm going to act it out now.
Yeah.
In the same way, actually, that we would probably agree that the social contagion theory of trans, or even like, honestly, gayness and stuff,
Yeah.
homosexuality, because like you're putting it out there, you're saying, hey, this is exciting. This is new. This makes you special. These people are special. Other people are just normal, but these people are special. And then you tell that to little kids, and they're like, maybe that's me. Maybe I'm special too. And that's the obvious way that it's working. But you're giving them a role. You're giving a thing to inhabit.
You're doing
And-
the
and so
thing
they'll be
that
having.
the theory was rejecting in the first place.
Exactly.
Social
So they're creating trans by giving them a script.
An alternative social conditioning program.
Yeah, and men ask me all the time. I mean, this is one of the number one questions I get, especially from young men, and it's always framed in a terrible way. But how do I become more masculine? Because they're looking to fake it till they make it, and that is real. There is an element of performance in being masculine or being feminine, and in the same way that I've also said. And we all know, really, that if someone who is super gay, like really, 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 really gay, a lot of that is a performance. Like they've decided that they're homosexual, and then they see that what that means, the stereotype of being gay, and then they inhabit it.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden they're like snapping and talking like this. And and then you catch that person in a stressful situation, and they'll just talk normal, because they're doing a whole performance of that, or they just do it for so long that it becomes who they are, because that is part of it too. I think there is a lot of malleability to personality, but the thing is, the traits that we associate with masculinity and femininity do follow from biology.
Exactly. Well, and this, I feel like we're going straight back to the way of men here, because there is an answer to the question, how do I become more masculine? Why is there an answer to that is universally true if gender was merely performative, if it was only socially constructed and had no basis at all in biology? You would not expect it to be universal if it was only socially constructed. You would expect we do masculinity one way in Samoa, we do it a different way in Afghanistan, we do it in a different way in Brazil, and a different way totally in Canada, which is true. But you have, and we do have variation on a theme, but there are those commonalities that you pointed out and wrote about. And as Brett Weinstein has pointed out, these seem to transcend not just human beings to other mammals and other animals outside of mammals, but these particular kinds of gender roles even transcend the animal kingdom into plants and other forms of life, and to the point where he described the male and gender roles as like, he almost got kind of mystical about it. This biologist, Brett Weinstein, is like this. It almost seems like a law of the universe at work here, in like men taking on the more combative, providing roles, and women, or we shouldn't say woman, because woman refers to humans. The female takes on the, more of the localized, care for the young role, which isn't obviously the same thing with gendered trees, or I should say sexed trees. There are some trees that have very distinct males and females. The mountain ash is the only one I can think of off the top of my head, but there are others. And there it's like, it expresses itself a little different, but it was interesting hearing Brett Weinstein talking about it outside of humans and even outside of mammals, but much more broadly.
Right. Right. I mean, it does get a little bit murkier. I mean, there is a lot
Yeah.
more variation when you get in outside of even mammals, and even within mammals. I mean, you like if you look at like the roles of like a tigress
Oh, sure.
compared to like the way that things operate with say chimpanzees.
Yeah.
It's a different vibe, but there's different roles there, and they have like but they have an evolutionary basis in like how these behave, and you don't
Yeah.
apply one to the other in that way. And so, I think it's important to recognize the level of performance that is involved, but that in the way that we say becoming the best version of yourself. Different societies create different rules for the performance. All the different things that you wear, all the different ways that you talk. You say one things, whatever. Like we always joke with the Australians that Australians add what would be considered cutesy language in America.
Oh, yes. The Barbie.
Yeah, they add ease to everything. Like, and that's baby talk. That's like cutesy baby talk in American. Like if you add like an I or whatever the Y to things, it becomes like what do you little trying to think of way that they do it in Spanish too. There's a way that they do it there, but if you add that to a normal thing, it becomes like a feminine silly thing. But in Australia they do it. Everything is like that. Like Tasmania is Tassie. It's Tassie. Yeah, like whereas that would be like, why are you calling it that in American? It would be strange. But so we do different things, all across different cultures. And this has been the argument really that I got into with the Way of Mem was that the idea coming from the trans feminist movement about sex and gender or whatever is that because it changes from culture to culture, there's so many different cultural rules, and it's different everywhere, different in social classes, different in whatever. The rules change as to what masculinity really looks like. The superficial rules change, and because of that, they say it doesn't really mean anything and it doesn't exist.
Yeah, they talk about masculinities, plural.
Exactly, that it's all culturally constructed, and that was of course based on like really blank slate theory. That was when they were conceiving of all of this, which that's been refuted, but like now we have this mess that's continued that was based on it, and it's there are things that do naturally follow from being stronger, and being stronger, being probably a little bit more aggressive, because we know what hormones do, like that's
well, yeah. And this sort of dovetails into the sort of ongoing conversation we'd been having earlier this week, which is, all of this gender sex separation seems to be contingent upon and hinges upon a kind of implicit or sometimes explicit dualism, a presumption that the mind is separate from and sometimes completely separate from the body. And that's in fact what it means to be transgenders. You are born in the wrong body. Well, right. Who is that you that is apart from this body that you're inhabiting, if you are not your body? Well, it has to be a mind that is apart from the body. And this could go back to the pathology conversation, because like you could imagine being born with the wrong arms if you weren't
is
born
your
with
gender
any.
In the room with us right now?
right. And the question of dualism is an interesting one, because very, very few biologists would have the balls to, I shouldn't say that because we're in the wrong subject for that, would have the courage to admit that they're a dualist, even if they were. I think right. Very, very few of them would even fall into that category. But it sort of is taken up as a serious position among philosophy and philosophers in some cases, because it makes some questions a little bit simpler to address. But I think, given what we know about the brain from a biological standpoint, it's a lot simpler to say, no, we might not be able to explain how it works. We might not understand the mechanism by which the mind generates this subjective experience. We haven't solved the hard problem of consciousness by any stretch of the imagination. But we know that your brain has something to do with your experience of the world. And your mind is not something apart from your body. Your mind is your body. And in fact, you experience your mind through your body. As Nietzsche would say, your mind is nothing other than something about the body. Although I think he was speaking of soul, but we could apply it to mind just as well.
Yeah. I mean, kind of same difference in this, situation. But yeah, I mean, and that's why the whole trans argument and the idea about gender becomes very metaphysical at some point, because okay, well, where is this? I believe this discussion we both were reading separately about these things, and then it hit into Cartesian mind body dualism, and that became like the common thread of these two things, which was kind of funny because we were literally like talking about that on the same day. Like I'm on Wikipedia looking like, oh, okay, all right.
I've been slowly chugging through Heidegger's Being and Time, and he's getting to his critique of Kant and Descartes, sort of in the same, not quite the same page, but in the same section, because Kant was picking up where Descartes left off. And Descartes was perhaps the most famous dualist. And so Heidegger's view is that Kant was unable to properly explore the subject of being, which is hard to explain when Heidegger's talking about this thing, what he means by Dasein and being with a capital B. But it has something to do with subjective experience and attention and presence. And so he was talking about time and the experience of time and what that has to do with being. But the dualism seems to be a part of the problem, and why Kant was not successfully able to address that. And perhaps why, these gender theorists who have tacitly accepted dualism keep seeming to come to nonsensical or absurd conclusions that logically follow from the premises, but look at the premises that we're working with here.
Yeah. Someone, when we were discussing this in I think, on the chat in Order of Fire on the First Man, somebody, I think it was Jeremy, actually said, what I'm getting from this is that gender is about feelings. And, and I'm like, that pretty much sums it up. Yeah. I feel like I'm something else. And my argument against the trans thing, whatever, has always been, you have no actual physical experience of what that is. Your idea of what the opposite sex is always going to be a caricature. Now, you can have a pretty good sense of it from knowing someone of the opposite sex and like being around them all the time, or whatever, and seeing what their experience is, but you haven't experienced that. And it is not part of, as the communists would say, your lived experience. And so it is just a caricature, your idea of a woman.
It's one of the sort of experiential just kill shots against so-called standpoint theory, the idea that the slave actually knows what the master wants, but the master doesn't know what the slave wants because the slave has to serve the master so they know what they want. You see the exact opposite in the trans world. My wife had a friend, a coworker actually, whose husband decided to come out as trans, and he was dressing up as the most ridiculous caricature of like slutty costumes and stuff, and its former wife, my wife's friend and coworker, was like, is that how you think we act? Is that what you think being a woman is about? You have no idea whatsoever. And this is the I don't want to dismiss the importance of feelings, because the line between feelings and sensations gets very blurred at like the philosophical level, and feelings can be very valuable. but there is also a danger in putting too much stock in the like the primacy of feelings, when feelings can be so easily, as you were speaking of before with the social contagion theory, kind of molded by other people, and you end up with copies of copies of copies of reality as an ideal, and you find yourself attempting to imitate something that not only doesn't exist but never existed in real life. I've been listening to. Oh, go ahead.
It's like you're feeling, and feelings can also be easily dismissed, in the sense that, like, like you have all kinds of feelings, and part of what when people talk about stoicism, or people talk about masculinity, is editing your feelings, basically. Like, okay, well, I feel X way, but that's not productive right now. I mean, I think that's right. It's just healthy psychology generally. But just because you feel a certain way and you have a feeling doesn't mean that it's like absolutely world defining. It needs to change everything. That's what emotional control is. Okay, I felt a certain way, but am I going to act on that? Am I going to let that define me, or am I going to let that pass over? And or otherwise, you have to act on every feeling that you have. Like, I feel murderous today. That doesn't mean that you just don't do that. You don't act out on that necessarily. And so, I think what happens with a lot of people, and just theories of sexuality generally, and sexual identity, and all these things, is that you have a feeling that relates to your caricature of the opposite sex. Like, I've been told I'm not supposed to have this feeling, but I'm having this feeling that I attribute to the opposite sex. Therefore, there's something inside me that's wrong. And I think that that's the core of it.
You know what I think, that relating to what you're talking about, what maybe one of the core and key words that is one of those words that takes us to a couple different reductio ad absurdums in this whole subject. But the word that seems to unlock or at least open the box to this whole question is authenticity. Because it feels like authenticity is the justification that people give for acting out on their feelings in the moment. And saying, well, if I don't do this, I'm not being authentic. And that's some kind of ideal that we should be pursuing. It used to be called just bad impulse control. And if you listen to Paul Ekman, his guide to sanity, essentially, and emotional control is all about trying to increase the time gap between experiencing an impulse and acting upon it. And it's like maturity, both for men and for women. I think that's not even a gendered thing. It's just about being a more responsible and higher agency adult human being. But this word authenticity, which is one of these words that comes from Heidegger in modern, spiritual philosophical parlance. Of course, he wasn't idealizing it exactly in this way that they've taken it, but it seems to imply that people should reduce that impulse time gap and should say what they're thinking as they're thinking it, on pain of being inauthentic and on pain of not being real. And so that can take you to some very weird places where people say a man acting as if he was a woman is authentic somehow. And here we have a reduction to the absurd of this ideal. And maybe we need a better, I don't know what this reveals about authenticity as an ideal, but maybe there's something worth saving in the idea of authenticity. But we need to either refine our conception of what authenticity means, or maybe find a better ideal than authenticity to strive for personally.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of authenticity, like, is it has become very popular. That I'm not. Didn't I think I had somebody in my comments on Instagram say something like that. He thought we were aligned and we were not aligned. Basically, he said, like he was he decided that he would say whatever is on his mind all the time, and and that's his true expression of masculinity. I think maybe it was when I was talking about masculinity, humility, and things like that. But that he thought it was being radically authentic by doing that, and that was the most masculine thing he could be, is be radically authentic. And I was like, no, no, that's absolutely wrong. But it's
There's no honor
and again,
culture in which that's okay. There's no honor culture in which that's okay.
Well, 100%. And but obviously there's the whole argument of all these people is that like all those things are oppressive, right? I mean that's the Marxist thing, is that all those things are oppressive and they're stopping you from being who you really are. Maybe that's why this authenticity thing is so popular.
But this brings us back to the dualism thing. At the heart of Marxism is the idea that reality itself is oppressive, that matter is oppressive to the pure mind, and not just to Marxism, but to Gnosticism, which we talked about before.
Right.
And James Lindsay and other people before James had pointed out that Marx was a Gnostic spiritually, and conveyed this just through a language of economics later on in life, but even in a language of spirituality earlier on. And it feels like you have this same dualistic Gnostic notion of material reality is oppressing my my pure mind at work here. And but like if you reject the dualism, if you reject the idea that the mind is somehow something separate from the body, then the oppression of the body and the social expectations that come along with your body and with the rest of the material world that you occupy, because all these other minds that are telling you these things are also material. They're also part of nature. They're part of the world. The idea of calling society this like oppressive, like spiritual force that is apart from nature. How do you separate that? That becomes a kind of nonsensical separation as well. What is society apart from, your being as a social animal? The organism of an ant as an individual doesn't make sense outside of the context of the colony. Now, we're not colony animals, we're not ants, but we are social mammals like chimps or wolves or lions. And our being, our linguistic capacity, our ability to run long distances, all of these other physical traits about us don't make a whole lot of sense outside of this social context. So what is this oppressive social context we're speaking of, apart from the physical reality of who we are? And we can talk about real oppressive forces. I don't mean to dismiss the reality of the oppressions of society in some sense, but there's a difference between speaking of it in a sort of a grand general sense versus pointing out very specific problems. And it's a different kind of claim to be like, I think this law is a bad idea versus society is inherently oppressive.
Right.
Compared to what your notion of a pure mind unfettered by your misgendered body or something.
And that's an inconceivable thing.
Yeah.
That's basically like a fantasy about a fantasy, because you can't really. And I've made this argument in many ways when we're talking about AI, we're talking about transhumanism and so forth. We in the way that I have no idea what it is to be a woman, to have that package of experiences that come with that, to have to negotiate through the world as a woman. I also don't know what it is to be a horse or another kind of animal, or a creature that does not have a body.
Have I mentioned Thomas Nagel's essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat, before?
Yeah, I think we talked about it last time for some other reason, but yeah. I mean, but we can't. Everything we process is through our sensory inputs, and I'm sure, and I know that there are tons of philosophical arguments about that, discussions about that, but I don't even think we need to get into them to say that that's true. Is that our whole brains are designed to receive inputs from certain kinds of things, and if we don't know how to process like a fly's eyes, like that reality, and so all these different frequencies of light, all these different things, and so you couldn't. Yeah, I mean, you are consciousness, and the mind, and all this is attached to the body, and it has its home there, and the idea that there's something separate from that's outside of the physical form is a little bit of a hallucination.
Yeah, and here we're in danger of a bunch of nerds bringing up the so-called hard problem of consciousness, which is how can physical matter, even in principle, give rise to subjective experience, which is probably not a subject either of us are equipped to deal with, given that no philosopher has actually solved this problem. But it's also true to say that no one else can conclusively, deduce anything from that either. You can't just appeal to one's own lack of imagination and say, well, I can't see how it happens, therefore the mind must be completely separate in kind from the body. And we'll leave it at that stalemate.
Yeah. Well, I think the sex roles and the performative aspect of sex and the cultural aspect of sex, while there are parts that change, a lot of them are geared towards basically bringing out the best of what you have. Here are the things that make you different, and here are all of these societies for all this time have come to the same conclusions about certain things.
Here's how you capitalize on that.
Here's how you capitalize it in terms of it being best practices. Like, okay, well, to be the best adult man that you have to be, here are the steps that you need to go through to do that. Here's the way that you need to learn to behave.
And you might be surprised to discover that contrary to all of your ideals about authenticity and freedom, you might actually be happier if you become a better version of yourself rather than a worse version of yourself.
Rather than, I mean, that's the problem with trans is that they're trying to become something that they can never actually become.
Right.
And so it's cruel to like put that out there that they should do that. Like you're putting them in a conundrum that they can't solve. They can't. I mean, their entire ability to solve it is based on their ability to deceive. Well, if I've passed, if no one noticed, or I didn't notice that anyone noticed, if I went out dressed like a woman tomorrow and everybody treated me like a woman, then I won. I deceived them. Is basically that's what it comes down to. It's deception.
You know what we should talk about after this? Maybe not next week, but some week, is artificial intelligence. Because the crowning achievement, supposedly, the goal for artificial intelligence language programs for many years was the Turing test. Right. Could an AI pass as a human being in a social context? And it actually seems very similar to the sort of trans ideal of passing. It's a kind of gender Turing test. Now, I think the trans test is a little bit tougher because it's harder to pass in person than it is over, text on a screen. But there's something similar in the way that being a particular gender or being a human is conceptualized. when the test determining it is, can you fool other people into thinking you're the thing? There's something weirdly similar in how the thing is conceptualized there. It might be worth exploring, or it might be worth thinking about for anyone else who's listening to this as well.
And maybe it is an interesting comparison. I mean, it is all about fooling somebody, but you're not. It's like the thing is, you know the truth. Like even if you did fool everybody, you know that you're not really exactly the thing that you said that you're trying to tell them that you are.
Yeah.
And so it becomes this thing that where you're hiding a reality in order to deceive people so that you can have this experience of being that, but you're not really having that experience because you have this underlying experience that's there that nobody sees or that you don't think anybody sees. There's this underlying experience of like, am I passing? Am I passing? Am I passing? Am I passing? Yeah. And you could say, I think a Judith Butler would say that like we all have that. And there is a truth of that. That's the nervousness of masculinity that I talk about. Like this is why dudes are so vulnerable to marketing. You could, if you say that they're going to be a man, and if they buy this or do this, they're nervous enough about being a man that they'll buy it. Right. Like that's okay. This is how people will think that I'm more manly. Therefore, I should do that. But that's because they really, my argument has always been that a lot of that nervousness comes from we're always trying to prove ourselves as men. That's our psychological makeup, is to try and prove ourselves as men to other men and women, because that's part of how it works. But there's a I forgot where I was going with that one, but anyway, lost it.
Well, it does bring up an interesting question too, because I mean, when the Marxists and gender theorists talk about society's pressures and ideals as oppressive, they're not always wrong, especially when we're talking about marketing, right? Marketers or politicians or any number of people can be giving you bad ideals, and but who's to say they're bad? It takes a degree of judgment, and so it's easy to flip back and forth between the binary of we need to conform to collective standards of good that make us all better, and all the people in power are lying, and it's all the essentially postmodernist position that everything is propaganda. Everything is for someone else's interests, that is some story they're trying to sell you for their own power and financial benefit. And there's a degree of truth to that, but it isn't absolute. And so it does take a degree of sort of this circumlocution of experience and figuring things out and trying and going back and gradually refining your view, because not everything is BS. A lot of it is. But just because some standards of masculinity are admittedly quite ridiculous,
some of them are the worst. Some of them are like some of them. I mean, this has been my thing since there is a blue collar retarded masculinity in America specifically that makes you want to not be masculine because it's so fucking stupid. There is you couldn't do that because and it's literally like because someone in my community said a thing. It's so arbitrary and so stupid and so closed down, and I have to be dumb and I can't understand like culture or
Curtis Yarvin spoke of the tendency in more modern times for Gen Z kids of some guy, a fairly precocious student in a classroom, hearing teachers saying dumb things, hating the system, deciding to do the opposite and to become a Nazi, as the case may be, because that's the metal way I'm going to stick it to the man. Which he says, like, there's way more metal ways of being metal than doing that. You're still in their frame. And it feels like, you don't have to go back too many decades to envision and empathize with this exact same precocious young man who would have been growing up in that kind of rural redneck environment. And you're like, you're not a man unless you're doing dumb things, watching sports ball and drinking Bud Light.
Right.
I could understand wanting to swing the opposite direction.
Oh yeah, that was me. that was me. I mean, I went to school in New York City to be a fashion designer because I thought they all sucked. It was like my Uncle Tim was the worst example. If you would say anything remotely like intelligent or cultured, and the dude would be like, "I bet you sit down to pee." It was just the worst, most retarded dude. Worked on the railroad his whole entire life until he got fired for stealing oil. And it had to work. And then he actually got a wife who was a Democrat. Well, they were Democrats because Labor used to be Democrat, and so he got this like Democratic wife with like TDS, and he just retired and kind of like lame. And so I think she totally runs him now, and he won't even talk to my dad, and they're twins. Because they have like a political like dispute because she told him his feelings, So he became this like totally like pussy whip dude at the end of his life. But like me dealing with him growing up, it was just like, I hate if this guy is what masculinity is. Fuck it. Basically like this is because I'm a young kid who's like interested in ideas and art and all this kind of stuff, and like his version of masculinity was trash. And and I grew up in a rural town, and I got a lot of that. And so like there's a ton of people who I think who had that experience, and in some way or another, and it's just the different degrees, and their response to it is a complete, like you said, I don't like communists, so I'm going to become a Nazi, experience, and I did that myself with that. Yeah. Well, it's many things, but and then you realize that like, okay, well that's too far, and really a lot of my work comes from the idea of like, well, I missed something that was good in the thing that I was rebelling against.
Right, and I feel like your essay on sex pollution really touches on this too, because there's so many things that men have begun to reject because women start to do it. Right. And they wind up just in a position of disempowering themselves, of throwing away power. I've been on a bender listening to James Sexton, who is a divorce attorney in New York. He's been making the rounds on social media. I'm sure plenty of people have heard his stuff. The wisdom he's bringing in talking about marriages, how marriages break down, what keeps couples together. It's like, this is very valuable information and could give you a lot of power in your relationship in order to keep things going well and so forth. And it feels like many men have sort of thrown that away and said, oh, that's something that women focus on, much in the way that sort of rural caricature manly men seem to think anything intellectual is something like something liberals do, like kind of thing. It always reminds me of the line from Aristotle's Rhetoric, which I never get tired of saying, that like it is absurd to think that a man should be able to defend himself with his limbs, but should be ashamed of being able to defend himself with words, when words are more unique to the human animal than the use of limbs. And I love it because it presupposes the expectation of physical capability. It doesn't view them as exclusive at all, and rather as like mutually balancing, or at least both are beneficial forces for a man. And you're only multiplying your power and your competence and your capability by developing more skills. And so like sex pollution is a real phenomenon for sure. But you have to be careful not to do the swing move, like, oh, I'm in a communist town, so I'm going to become a Nazi, or I'm in surrounded by a bunch of dumb rednecks, so I'm gonna do the opposite of that.
Yeah.
It's
Well, and
it's
I
a.
think, yeah,
Oh, I was just gonna say,
finish that thought. Yeah.
I so get it. It makes so much sense, and I've been there myself in a few cases. But
Yeah.
you know, you're giving up so much more.
And a lot of the female version of this, and I can think of what they're giving up actually. And now a lot of the female version of this, we can be empathetic to that as well, because when you think about the stereotypical like wife role, say 1950 and before, you have a lot of women who are now, you go too much further back, then they're on the farm and they're busy. They're too busy for this navel gazing feminist bullshit. But if you, it's more a privileged class of women who really cared about feminism. But you can see them watching the typical wife get all flustered about making cookies and things that seem ditzy. Ditzy is the best way I can describe it. Things that seem like superficial and childlike, and a lot of femininity could be caricatured in a way that is very. I think if you're an intelligent woman, you could look at it and be like, seriously, like that's what this is. Like, oh, I'm just supposed to say yes, dear, to everything, and agree with every dumb thing that this man says, and just be. I mean, I can see as an intelligent woman, you would be like, really? Like,
isn't that what A Doll's House was written based upon? I forget who wrote it. It was Insack. I'll have to look up the author's name. It was a very famous play.
Maybe. I mean, I'm thinking Betty Friedan.
Henrik Ibsen.
Okay, yeah, it makes sense. Yeah,
or maybe a better example. Have you ever seen one of those wedding bridal pictures where it's the bride and all the women involved, and they're all smiling and doing the thing, and there's that like one chick in the crowd who's just like,
yeah,
like this, or more often this one,
right?
And all the guys like, that's the girl I want, that one there. Maybe,
right? Maybe not. Maybe like that. But no, I mean, because the guys get confused and think they want a girl who acts like them, right? Because they think that female behavior is ridiculous, but. A lot of the females actually, in the same way that men behaving in a more masculine way get something positive out of it. There's a lot of things that women get out of that experience. I mean, obviously, the Betty Friedan, idea, like, is this all that I get? Is that I have to vacuum and worry about petty social things while my husband is out doing publishing work and doing exciting things. I mean, that was really what feminism started from, a lot of it, at least the 20th century version of it. And this idea that they could do so much more, than they were underutilized. And but then what they lost in the bargain of deciding that they wanted to be out there doing exciting things, a lot of them lost motherhood.
Yeah.
And that's a big, and that was like an unforeseen real conclusion, like for them, like that that a lot of women actually would prefer to have that.
And they also might have discovered, all these Marxist feminist women, that the capitalist workday was maybe not quite as rewarding and fulfilling as they had imagined it to be when they saw their husbands going off to work.
Well, yeah, but I mean, like, there's a privileged class of women that are well-bred and making a lot of money, like what they call girl bosses now.
Yeah.
Who they went to school, they made a lot of money, they make a lot of money, they're very independent, they can do all these things, and most corporate jobs, most people don't like their jobs, or they tolerate their jobs at best. I think that most people don't want to be doing what they're doing. But the exciting part that these women were seeing in the 50s and so forth was these men who were doing the thing that they wanted to do. And so like, yeah, there are women out in publishing and doing all kinds of exciting jobs, but they are a small minority of women. Most women are I'm like, did these women really fight to go work at Walmart? Because there are a lot of women working at Walmart who have to send their kids to daycare so that they can work at Walmart. And that is not exciting or like rewarding and fulfilling and all these things. But those are most of the jobs. Like a lot of average people have to do really boring, stupid jobs. And when a lot of the women could be home with their kids, but not we, but people created a society where they can't be. And that was really a result of feminism, of these few women who wanted to have this exciting lifestyle, but what they did was sold out all those other women who were happy being wives and mothers, and now they have to go to this stupid job all the time and say stupid things and do all these things that men would have had to do in their place.
Yeah. And I feel like this sort of comes back to the whole gender versus sex question, because at the end of the day, it all seems to come down to what makes you happy. What makes you happy? And the existentialists of the 1920s would say existence precedes essence, and there is no ultimate meaning in life or purpose, so we have to create our own meaning. And so purpose and happiness is found in that process of creation. And they're not totally wrong, because there's a lot of variation in existence, and we don't, there's no playbook for our precise context. But we're also, as we've been variously saying, we're not blank slates either. And our brains are constructed in a very particular way, which we've inherited. And the fact that there are some variations between men and some variations between women does not mean that there aren't general patterns. And those general patterns do give us some clue and some guide as far as what actually really makes us happy. And there are patterns there. And fighting against your biological nature does not seem to be a recipe for happiness. Now, it might be a recipe for, momentary frustration and disillusionment and broken dreams if you have bought into ideals of absolute freedom and the sort of create your own purpose in life notion. The merely inherited biological roles can sound very mundane, very boring if you speak of them in a sufficiently degrading fashion. But the people who simply fulfill those roles, on the whole, relative to the people who try to combat them, seem to live quite good lives and quite happy lives. And I feel like of all the people in the red pill space, of all the Rollo Tomassis and Andrew Tates and Tim Ferriss's, teaching guys how to escape the matrix and create their own existence outside of the pipeline, whatever. The guy who seems to have led more men to more happiness, as far as I can tell, is Mike Rowe. And he is, the irony is he's not talking about escaping the matrix at all. He's talking about just fulfilling roles and needs. But the people who follow his advice, as I tried to do, they escaped the linguistic matrix of the marketers, whether those the right-wing entrepreneur marketers or the left-wing ideological political marketers, encouraging you to be dissatisfied with whatever you have at the moment. And this is not to say you shouldn't strive for more. You shouldn't strive to be better, because you absolutely should. But this goes back to the whole, you have to understand the balance. You have to understand what you're working with and accept that as a starting point. If you accept that you only have one finger on each hand and build from there, you can still become a jiu-jitsu black belt. If you are born blind and begin with accepting that, you can follow the example of the Batman. This is one of my favorite TED Talks. And I don't know, like teach yourself to echolocate or come up with strategies to get around in the world. If you are born a man and you accept that, if you are born a woman and you accept that, and you build from that foundation, you're probably going to do a lot better than if you try to fight against physical reality.
Yeah, and there's always going to be people who don't fit into molds very well.
Sure.
And I mean, that's something I'm fairly familiar with in life. But there's a good way to do that and a bad way to do that. And one of my favorite quotes that I've come up with in the past few years is just that, there's nothing really worse than the person who has to remake the entire world in their own image to be happy. And that's really what we see in all of this, is this argument from pathology is like, I'm different, therefore the whole world has to be like me, or I can't be happy.
Yeah.
And before that mindset came into being, what you had was people who were like, I'm different, I understand what that means, I don't need to redesign the mainstream around me because I understand that I'm different. I can see the good in other things. I just happen to be different.
Yeah.
And that is the healthy way to be different. And you may have like some biting social commentary on some of the things that people do around you because you're not like them. But and that was traditionally what a lot of these people did. Whether they became playwrights or your Oscar Wildes of the world. That they had like, oh, I see some foolishness in your like little games that you go that I'm not a part of. I can kind of watch from the outside and be like, wow, all right. But at the same time, to not have to reshape the world around that and realize the value in the norms.
And you don't have to be the center.
Right.
This whole question about marginalization and bring the margins to the center, I think reveals the naked political nature of this, and that it is not in fact about the margins, it's about the coalition. This is one of the points that James Sexton was actually bringing up. I was just listening to this earlier today. He said people used to think, even earlier in American history, of fame as a sort of unfortunate byproduct of having a unique skill. It was something to be kind of, it was sort of an unfortunate fate to become famous. But nowadays it's thought of as something to be pursued and as a source of power, which it is, but it's also a source of intense suffering and problems. And I think many of the people who are asking for that don't realize what they're asking for. They're like, asking the evil genie for things they don't understand. And you are, in most cases, far better off for wishing to be at the margins. That's where privacy and real freedom actually lies, more so than being at the center.
It makes me think of, a lot of these people existed in what the French called the demi-monde. Like this kind of underworld that of society that was they existed in this, and there are a lot of problems with that because really the demi-monde tends to have cops roll in and beat everybody up and stuff like that. But demi-mondes are not all fun. But that is a lot of what happened. Is that was like an undercurrent of society. There was something happening there. And then, and that was different. It was like a different universe where the rules are all different, and that happens like subcultures and stuff. But that doesn't mean that should be the main culture, because then you run into all these unforeseen problems. Like I said, it's like these people like the thing that feminists cause. Okay, well like, have you figured out what you're going to do when you're 60 and have no kids? That's because it's not going to be exciting anymore. You're not going to have martinis and getting fucked. Like you're going to be eating pudding at a nursing home alone.
Well, there are like experimental new dead imams, or I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that French words again, but there are also older ones. Like, what do you or I know about what it's like to be Amish?
Right.
For example. To take a fictional example, I think the sort of idealized rendition of this would be the Shire in The Lord of the Rings, where even the ancient Ents who know all about what's going on in different parts of Middle Earth have never heard of hobbits or the Shire. What's a hobbit? Says Treebeard to Merry and Pippin. And he doesn't know what he's looking at because they've been living, to borrow another French philosopher's phrase, as people in the shade, or people on the margins, so to speak. And like to be normal, which is its own segue into some more gender theory. We don't need to talk about queer stuff this time around, I guess. But
we kind of already did. It's all in the
I
thing.
suppose so. It's all kind of related.
It's all in the mix.
But to be normal is to be fairly uninteresting to a sort of broad audience. You have to get really niche. If you could find the finest Adirondack chair crafter in all the Catskills of upstate New York, and that guy is going to be very, very interesting to about 30 people, in the country. But those people really care, and is it really a good thing to draw the eyeballs of, 30 million or perhaps 8 billion people? Maybe that's kind of dangerous. Maybe that's not super desirable. Maybe that does weird things to your brain, that you're not really, you weren't built as an organism to deal with that kind of pressure and that kind of attention. Maybe, so much of the desire for power seems to come from a place of feeling neglected, that you could deal with the experiential problems you're having on your own, but someone convinced you that you're feeling like this because of the way politics are. We need to change things politically in order for you to become happy. And so people start doing crazy things.
Right.
So it's unfortunate, but if you give up the goal of being at the center, and you begin with an acceptance of where you are and what you are, the path forward becomes a little bit clearer, and I think happiness maybe becomes more achievable.
Maybe. It just depends who you are. I
For
think,
sure. For sure.
There's the old saying, like, who dares wins. And like the people who stick their necks out sometimes get their heads chopped off, but also they're also, like, oh, no one will remember your name. People, the great men of history. You can't believe in great man thing. Nobody, if everybody stayed home and just wanted to not be looked at, and wanted to live a private life, there are no great men. So
for sure, and we should be tremendously grateful to the great men for bringing great things. Whether it's enviable to be a great man is a separate question.
For sure.
We ask Elon Musk, is it a good thing to be him? He say, you should not envy me. It's not pleasant to be me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look at like, not to whatever. Blow him up too much, but Donald Trump. Did you think what that is? Like, he's actually reaching like saint-like levels of like suffering. There's literally like passion play levels of suffering. Like, he spent like half the year in court, like being accused of things. and then he just got shot. Almost died. By like whatever, like that, like
The quick head turn.
the quick head turn, or it would have been, it had the bullet in the side of his brain. Yeah, I mean, just constant scrutiny and constant people just literally hate you. It is hard to imagine. I mean, I have the smallest amount of boring fame, dwindling fame, but I've had enough experiences where that makes where I used to look at I'm like, could you imagine being Britney Spears?
You talk about you were talking about people being different. Not everyone's like that. Some people are genuinely different. Trump is genuinely different. That man seems to thrive upon and even crave the kind of pressure that would kill a normal person, like literally drive them to suicide. If a normal person experienced what Trump they wouldn't need an outside shooter, So
it's pretty much, it's actually what I imagine is that he seems almost as though it's actually surprising he didn't get a little bit more religious. In the sense that most people in that situation would be like, okay, I'm doing God's work. And I have God's given me, you give me your hardest struggles. I'm here for a reason. I mean, a lot of people would go, that's where they would go, because it would, to make sense of it. I am God's weapon, at this point, I'm here to do a great thing. And it doesn't seem like he's really gotten that way, which, I like about him, but you would very much be like I have divine purpose now.
Matthew Crawford wrote an excellent little write-up about it, where he said, basically, let me see if I can find his exact phrasing. He says, here it is. And then the shooting and Trump's remarkable response to it. To see his defiance in the face of literal bullets hits you in the gut. One of these political creatures is not like any of the others. Of course, the exceptional nature of Trump has been the premise of the whole political system since his appearance, both for his supporters and for those who are horrified by him. But for about 60 seconds, all the noise of words got stripped away, and we saw the animal spirits of a bloodied man revealed, such that we never do in our fake politics. It was like a portal to a different dimension, call it reality. And he later goes on to say, the speed with which he jumped up and pumped his fist afterwards, there were liberal pundits who were saying he must have such a strong marketing instinct that in the moment he literally just got shot at, he must have thought this would be a good photo op moment. And Crawford's response is such a thought could only come from someone who has never had experience with anything like whizzing bullets. What it revealed was a kind of animal instinct in Trump, a part of his nature beneath thinking, beneath his plans or his strategy. That's just a part of his soul, for lack of a better phrase, a part of his character and his nature. And that's not a normal nature.
No. I mean, and honestly, I read that too, actually. I read that piece when it came in, because it's part of the free subscription. I don't have the paid one for him. But I did read that. And, I tend to think somewhere in between. Of that particular instance, and we're way off topic now, but
sure. We're talking about natures. So.
Yeah. Well, I think that for someone who turns lemons into lemonade for a living, and that is what he's been doing for so long. I mean, when he got when they gave him the convictions, and he's selling, he was talking to somebody and showing his mugshot T-shirts that he sells. He's like, oh, you see what we're reduced to. But, mugshots, Elvis had one, Frank Sinatra had one, but I've surpassed them. And I'm like, the idea that you take your mugshot and turn it into like a sign of power is so inconceivable. But this is what this guy does all day long. Yeah. So the idea that he got shot and he's like, okay, and then thought, fuck yeah, and then thought, I've got to show them. I think it almost come on like that kind of thing. They have to see. And I think we couple it something like that would be like that there needs to be a message sent. It would be like the way, not like mapping it out because the brain time isn't even there, but like mapping it out to like what political strategy was going to come from that. But like, this is the moment. I can totally think that he would have that conscious of a decision, not just like pure animal thing, but like
okay. Perhaps so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that seems reasonable for that kind of that guy.
But still, a profoundly unusual person.
For sure.
He would be a striking. Doesn't he only get like 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night too? If I remember reading that somewhere.
Yeah.
There's some group of tend to be older men who seem to just operate just fine on like 2 to 4 hours of sleep. It's crazy,
right.
But
yeah.
Well, anyways, those are also profoundly physically unusual people. But for the rest of us mortals, normal rules of biology are probably a better playbook. And the gender sex distinction is something that is both highlighted but also blurred intentionally. And I think just so much of the confusion and the sorcery is cleared up just by keeping things just by remembering what people are talking about, because they'll use them interchangeably until they don't. You know what I mean?
Well, they become basically the way it was described in one of these scholarly papers that I read, where basically he tracked all the usages from like the 1800s, like in print, using some AI or whatever, like tracked the all the usages of this of the words sex and gender, and their use, and his phrasing when he said it was like, at this point the sex and gender divide was created by feminists, like adopted at this point, and is observed only fitfully. It was the word I was like, oh, that's good. It is observed only fitfully. And that's true, because basically what feminists wanted to create this sex gender thing so they could talk about these two things separately and talk about stereotypes separate from biological sex, which that was the whole like feminist rationale for it. But what happened is that you put these two words and you just basically, for everybody else, they just became more popular synonyms.
Right.
Like no one used the word gender unless they were learning a language before. And now like gender and sex just became used interchangeably. Basically, people use gender now not in the mind-body dualism way that these gender studies people do, but people use it to talk about sex and the qualities associated with sex without actually talking about the physical act of sex, because unfortunately sex the act and sex the descriptive term are the same word.
Right.
There's there's the whatever, the adjective and the verb and or whatever. And
the noun
and so people don't want to use people want to use a word that talks about masculinity or femininity without talking about sex, the act. And one of our guys in the order actually brought that up too. And so that's become a way for people to talk about sex and qualities associated with sex without talking about fucking. Basically, like that's because those are different subject areas, and people are uncomfortable with the actual act of sex, and there's all, especially then there's the moral things and whatever,
Right.
and so it became a way to talk about sex and the qualities associated with sex that had nothing to do with the act of sex. So it kind of it separated those two things, and that's the way I think it's used most commonly today. Basically, I think the mainstream reappropriated it from the gender people and just said, "Oh, it's okay. It's the same. Here's how it's useful." And so, like, I mean, maybe I shouldn't stop trying to use the word gender. It's really, really hard for someone who's been writing about this stuff for years. It's really difficult. But I mean, I use it. Yeah, but my understanding of gender is attached to sex. So they're one and the same.
Yeah, and maybe this is a point we could close on because we've been going for a little while. But there's a there's a line from somewhere in De Maistre. I don't remember exactly where. I'm not going to look it up right now. But towards the end of his essay on the generative principle of political constitutions, De Maistre describes how it is impossible for man to give names to his own creations. And he doesn't mean like you can't give sounds to things and create associations, but the meaning of that word will ultimately be ascribed by other people. So no matter how positive of a term you try to give to your own creation, the connotation of that word will emerge socially. And my favorite example of this is how people, it seems like every 3 years we need to come up with a new euphemism for the mentally handicapped. Mentally handicapped is one of those euphemisms. Even retarded began as a euphemism. It was from the Italian just slow, and now it's like this gross insult to some people to call it retarded. It's like we're like 6 euphemisms in, but every time you ascribe a new euphemism to this condition, it acquires all of the negative connotations of the previous one. It's just a matter of time. And it feels like gender has a little bit of that going on with it. We've tried to create something separate, but it's just reacquired all the connotations that sex had before, just in a slightly different word.
Yeah, a good example that I've written about in the past is also gay. Gay was used to be euphemism for homosexuals, so that it would be something kind of a positive, happy thing. And then now it's become a universal term for anything that's stupid. It's like that's the word. It's like that was not what they had in mind.
Yeah, it's like the South Park episode where Stan is trying to explain his use of the word faggot to the judge. It's like, if someone cuts you off in traffic, they're a faggot. Well, what if they're what if they're a homosexual? Well, then they're a homosexual faggot. It's like yeah, that's all we're trying to say.
That absolutely happens. I'd like to think as a philosopher and creator of words and things, creator of words and stuff. I could have that like Zoolander or whatever. As a philosopher and creator of words and stuff, I would like to think that I have some agency over my own creations. I try really hard. Like solar idealism, like I don't fuck with that's my I like shit like that. But ultimately, I mean, it is true. Things take on a life of their own, and sometimes you can't control that.
But the beautiful thing about the way of men and about solar idealism is that the things you are describing are not things you created. Like masculinity precedes you, and it has all the positive connotations. So by praising this thing that is better, other people have now attached you to masculinity, which is kind of funny. But in delineating it, you sort of restored what was good and beautiful and excellent about masculinity in the face of all these like attempts to tear it down into plural masculinities and these caricatures of machismo and so forth. And in a similar manner, solar idealism is new. It's not a recreation of something in the past, but it is drawing upon a lot of stuff from the past, and the essential imagery of it, I think, is connected with that and is congruent with the vision here, which is just a positive alternative to the sort of negative reactionary forms of paganism out there.
Yeah.
And I think like it isn't up to us to, you know, whether how people will interpret it insofar as we can't just create the sufficiently perfect word that people can't help but take it in a positive way. Right. But if you do good work, if you are a good person and have good character and create a good group full of other people doing good work with good character, then the connotation can, in the long run, only go one way.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, there is with philosophy, as much as we could dispute that, I mean, you've spent time recently trying to figure out what dacing or whatever means because of what that guy meant about it. Like that, yeah. You needed to know what that guy actually meant. And all these other ideas are wrong because this is the guy who came up with it, and that's what it meant. And so there is some like thing where like the valid thing goes back to the source. So yes. It's not everything takes the path of gay. But anyway, we should probably wrap it up at that. I know people were planning on watching and were watching from the numbers, but I just saw like one or two comments
jumping all over the place. We had a fair number of watches. This is fairly esoteric, so I can imagine people just kind of soaking it up. But Nick Westendorf says, "Good work, gents." S. Robertson says, "All the women who sold us on suffrage and work wanted to free us from our work-at-home jobs that we did while watching kids because not getting to leave the property was oppressive." Probably true. Yeah. Although, like, there's a lot. There's a lot of suffering, I think, in general, if you go back to like the 1800s for like most people. Male or female.
Dudes were working in fucking coal mines. Yeah,
And the point that her name is escaping me now. She wrote as Girl Writes What for a while. Karen Strawn. That Karen Strawn used to bring up is that women got suffrage in the United States in 1922. And she follows that up by asking, guess when men got suffrage? Universal male suffrage. It's 1920. Just only 2 years before. And men won universal suffrage by means of a lawsuit that made it up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled, well, you know what, we don't want to give you universal suffrage, but since you were in the draft for World War I, it makes sense that you should get to vote if you can get drafted. So we'll grant you universal suffrage. That was 1920. Women get it 2 years later without the draft. So like the and as Strawn points out, there were a number of women who opposed female suffrage because they worried that it might bring along some kind of concomitant responsibilities. That they said, well, why are we trying to get this thing? So like the whole notion of patriarchy, when you go back to like just that 2 year gap, seems kind of silly, but maybe a conversation for legal experts at another time.
Yes.
Brock adds, the kitchen beats the trenches. True. In most cases. Yeah.
But all right. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. And thank you guys all for watching tonight. I think this went all over the place and was a lot of interesting philosophical ground to tread. And I hope you have a better understanding of the history of the word gender and some thoughts about how you may want to use it or not use it in the future.
Yeah,
and when to use it, or maybe just use it like and pretend that you don't know that there's supposed to be a difference. Yeah, you know,
some understanding of the games that people are playing when they make a big point about the distinction between the two.
Exactly. Yeah, and also, like the political aims behind it and so forth. And oh yeah, that's what I was going to say is that a big point, I think, a big takeaway from this is about the separation of it between the body and the mind.
Yes,
and
the dualistic
gender as
point,
being this thing outside the body that's separate from it. And
so
I think that's the famous thing to think about.
Cardboard sign that the guy holds up in the crowd is like, if gender doesn't have to do with sex, why does cutting off part of your body affirm it or whatever? It's the age old little philosophical query there, but it really, like, unlike most protest signs, it is a good point. Like the whole it is inherently and necessarily dualistic at the bottom of the day. Now you might take up the question of, am I a dualist or not? Maybe you might find some good philosophical reasons for doing that. If so, let me know. I haven't found any myself. But there are you wouldn't be in terrible company in abstract dualists, but you will probably find yourself in progressively worse company the further down that rabbit hole you go.
For sure.
For
sure. Cool. All right. Well, we'll have to think about it. If you have any ideas of what you'd like to see us talk about next week and you're into Discord, Discord gets quiet sometimes, but we are always watching it. So drop that in there and see what you'd like to have us talk about soon. We haven't planned the next shows yet. I need to get on that. Or if you have any things that you'd like us to expand on and so forth, I'd love to hear that as well. So until next time, I'm just going to sign off and stay solar.
Stay solar.